When the Salt Lake Temple was completed, the church had 4 operating temples, all in Utah. Latter-day Saints outside of Utah had to travel all the way there to be endowed and sealed, which was a major problem because around this time the church began encouraging members to gather in their own countries and not to the church's headquarters as they had done in the past. By this time, the church had become well established in the South Pacific in places like New Zealand, but not yet in Asia, despite early efforts to do so. But that would eventually change, beginning with the Meiji Restoration of 1868 in Japan. The Meiji government, in an effort to catch up with the West, began to send delegations around the world to study Western technology, government, and culture. One of these delegations was the Iwakura Mission. It left Japan on December 21st, 1871, bound for Washington, D.C. in the United States. The group of over 100 Japanese included many prominent government leaders of the samurai class and a member of the royal family, Prince Tomomi Iwakura. The members of the delegation arrived in San Francisco on January 15, 1872. After a short stay, they boarded the Transcontinental Railroad with stops planned in Chicago and Washington. However, their journey was interrupted unexpectedly when they arrived in Utah on February 4, 1872, and could go no farther due to unprecedented snowfall in the Wasatch Mountains. The group had no choice but to spend the next 19 days in Salt Lake City. As a result, the Japanese came to know the Latter-day Saints, and the Saints, in turn, came to know and respect the Japanese. 3 years later, as a consequence of this visit, the Japanese seriously considered having the Latter-day Saints come to Japan to settle the northern island of Hokkaido. At the time, Brigham Young was eyeing Mexico as a possible place to move the Saints because of growing persecution. But the Saints did not go to Japan at that time. In 1872, Lorenzo Snow, who was then president of the Utah Territorial Legislature, spent considerable time with the Iwakura Mission delegates, and in 1901, as president of the church, he announced that missionaries would be sent to Japan. Just 5 years earlier, in 1896, Utah, where the church was headquartered, had become a state, giving its citizens greater freedom than previously. For the dawning of the new century in 1901, President Snow issued a greeting to the world. In it, he said, "The aim of nations should be fraternity and mutual greatness." By sending out missionaries, he hoped to develop a friendly relationship with Japan that would benefit the people of both nations. Prior to that time, the church did not have the financial capability to open a mission, and Japan had not completely opened its doors to Christian missionaries. But in 1901, Elder Heber J. Grant of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and 3 other missionaries were called to open the new mission in Japan. It was the only permanent mission to be opened by the church in Asia prior to World War II. Soon the mission began to bear fruit. Although native Japanese had joined the church earlier in the United States, Hajime Nakazawa became the first Japanese to join the church in Japan when he was baptized in Omori on March 8, 1902. This photograph shows Brother Nakazawa, his wife, and a young relative. For more than 2 decades, missionaries served in Japan, and native Japanese joined the church and helped build Zion in their country. But eventually, the mission was closed in 1924. Many casual observers, and even some historians, have said that the early mission of the church in Japan was a failure. Only 88 missionaries served during that period, including 13 women, some of whom were wives of the men called. Many of the missionaries served as long as 6 years. Alma O. Taylor, who translated the Book of Mormon into Japanese, served for 8.5 years without coming home. Only 174 converts and children of record were baptized in those early years. After World War II, only a small number of Japanese members were still alive and willing to come back to church. The numbers may not seem impressive, but the individual stories are deep and meaningful. Sister Tsune Ishida Nachie, for example, one of the first women to join the church in Japan, was baptized in 1905. During that period, church leaders had begun to preach that members should gather in their own nations rather than to the church's headquarters. Prophets had testified that the gospel would spread throughout the earth, and for that to happen, newly baptized members needed to strengthen the church where they were. But converts to the church in all nations still needed the ordinances of salvation and exaltation for themselves and their ancestors, and that required a temple. Sister Nachie desired to receive her own temple blessings, but there were no temples in Japan at that time. In fact, when she joined the church in 1905, there were only 4 Latter-day Saint temples in all the world, all 4 of them in Utah: St. George, Logan, Manti, and Salt Lake City. Church leaders recognized that it was a hardship for church members like Sister Nachie to travel to Utah to receive their temple blessings, and so they began building temples closer to the members. The next temple to be constructed after these 4 was the Laia, Hawaii Temple. This temple was built between the United States and Japan on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dedicated in 1919, 14 years after Sister Nachie joined the church, it provided the closest location where she could be endowed and sealed. In 1923, at the age of 66, and just 1 year before the mission in Japan was closed, Sister Nachie left for Hawaii, where on June 5th, she received her own endowment and was sealed to her deceased husband. She remained in Hawaii doing work for her deceased ancestors, something she had desired to do since 1906, when she first heard a Sunday school lesson from one of the missionaries on vicarious work for the dead. She worked faithfully in the Laia Temple until her death in 1938. She also did missionary work in Hawaii. By the time she arrived there in 1923, well over 100,000 Japanese had arrived in Hawaii to work. Hawaii became the center of missionary work to the Japanese people during the period between the closure of the mission in Japan in 1924 and the end of World War II. This photograph shows the Japanese branch in Hawaii. Sister Nachie can be seen in the center of the photograph. At the far right is Elder George Albert Smith of the Quorum of the 12, who would become church president in 1945 at the end of the war. The president of the Hawaii Temple from 1936 to 1938 was this man, Edward L. Clissold. He became an active duty naval officer during World War II and was sent to a military government school at the University of Chicago, where he was trained to become a provincial governor in Japan. On arriving in Japan 2 months after the end of the war in October 1945, however, he was assigned to work in the office of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, also known by the acronym SCAP, which administered the legal affairs in Japan. He also met many faithful Latter-day Saint servicemen who were stationed in Japan, and he placed a small notice in a Tokyo newspaper asking for church members to contact him. Just before the mission in Japan was closed in 1924, church member Fujiya Nara and his wife were married. This is their wedding photograph. They are in the center of the front row. In 1948, after the war, Brother Nara saw Edward Clissold's notice in the newspaper and contacted him. Brother Nara also contacted other church members in Japan, and before long, a small handful of faithful saints surfaced and began to attend church with the servicemen. Brother Clissold's assignment with SCAP lasted only 2 months, and he was sent back to Hawaii. A year later, in the spring of 1947, the church called Edward Clissold to return to Japan to open the mission. Approval by the U.S. Department of War delayed the opening, and President Clissold finally arrived on March 6, 1948. Japan was still under occupation by U.S. forces, and the church was not allowed to send any missionaries to Japan until they had a place to live. President Clissold immediately began looking for a mission home. Tokyo had been devastated in the war, and housing was in short supply. After several days of endless driving all over Tokyo in search of a house for rent or for sale, President Clissold went for some relaxation to visit a former acquaintance, Sanosuke Hayakawa, whom he had met casually on the street during his previous assignment in 1945. Mr. Hayakawa was out of town, but the family was glad to see President Clissold and invited him in. President Clissold told them about his search for a house. Sanosuke Hayakawa's father assured him there was little possibility of success, but he offered to try to help, as did his son-in-law, Reiji Abe. A few days later, the father came to President Clissold's hotel and informed him that Mr. Abe had spoken to a friend, a Mr. Kawasoe, the business advisor of Prince Nobuhito Takamatsu, shown in this slide, the younger brother of Emperor Hirohito. The next day, March 20th, Clissold drove with Mr. Hayakawa and Mr. Abe to Prince Takamatsu's official residence to meet Mr. Kawasoe amid the elegant surroundings of the prince's mansion. Clissold explained the church's need, and Kawasoe provided the address of two properties he understood were for sale. Clissold, Abe, and Hayakawa immediately drove to see the properties. One of these was in Azabu, across the street from Arisagawa Park. The park had once been land owned by a relative of the prince. Although the house was a bombed-out shell, it had been a palatial residence and was in a very good neighborhood. President Clissold expressed interest in the property. Mr. Abe contacted Mr. Kawasoe again and was introduced to the agent who confirmed the property was for sale at 2 million yen, $10,000 at the current exchange rate. President Clissold asked Mr. Abe to see if they might obtain an option to buy the property while arranging for the funds. In the meantime, President Clissold was introduced by a banker friend to a Mr. Sekiya, one of the managers of a construction company known as Kajima Gumi. Mr. Sekiya went with President Clissold to inspect the property. President Clissold also asked two Latter-day Saint servicemen who were Army engineers to go with him. They all agreed that the skeleton of the building was in good condition and that the house was very well constructed, as evidenced by the fact that it was still standing after taking 3 direct bomb hits. President Clissold decided to proceed. This began a complex and frustrating series of negotiations and approval. The Lord had sent the perfect man for this assignment, given Clissold's knowledge of SCAP and his prior experience in real estate finance. The church in Salt Lake City immediately approved President Clissold's request to buy the property and sent the funds as security. President Clissold had multiple discussions with SCAP, Japanese banks and bankers, including the National Bank of Japan, the Japanese Government Foreign Bank of Trade, the Boekicho, and missionaries from other churches. But many obstacles to buying the property emerged. The owner had second thoughts about selling and was considering using the building as a clubhouse for his employees. The agent for the property would not reveal the name of the owner, so President Clissold, with only the property address and his imperfect Japanese, learned that the owner was Hachiro Shimizu, who had purchased the property only the year before. President Clissold pressed the agent to meet Mr. Shimizu, and a meeting was arranged. President Clissold liked Mr. Shimizu immediately and felt sure there was a way to buy the property. Still, many barriers remained, including whether the church could legally own the property. The church had never registered its name or set up an entity before the war, and so President Clissold incorporated the mission and registered the entity. Other barriers were removed by his old acquaintances at SCAP, but a final government restriction prevented the church from issuing a letter of guarantee to the owner. Fortunately, Mr. Shimizu said the word of the church would be sufficient. President Clissold gave Mr. Shimizu 1,000 yen, then the equivalent of a few dollars, and a deposit slip showing that the $10,000 was in the National City Bank of New York, earmarked for the property. Mr. Shimizu signed a contract to sell the property, and a lawyer retained by President Clissold said he had never seen such trust in all his experience. President Clissold obtained bids from contractors to repair the building and prepare the mission home. The Kajima Construction Company submitted a bid of only half as much as other bids and agreed to do the work for $13,500. More government and SCAP approvals were necessary because building materials were in short supply. President Clissold obtained the approvals and, in accordance with Japanese tradition, Kajima asked to have a Shinto ceremony to bless the land before beginning the work. President Clissold agreed, provided he could offer the prayer instead of the Shinto priest. 60 people attended the ceremony on May 19th, including brother and sister Nara and a handful of other Japanese and military members of the church. Ice cream was served, and the restoration of the mission home was underway. 3 weeks later, Edward Clissold moved into a room over the servants' quarters. The first 5 missionaries to Japan after the war arrived on June 26th. One of those missionaries would become my mission president, Harrison Theodore Ted Price, who is seated on the front row to the right in this photograph. Sister Clissold arrived in September, and the work on the mission home was completed on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1948. The remodeled mission home would house the mission president, his family, and missionaries for some 3 decades, including President Price, his family, and me. In June 1949, the year after the mission home was completed, Elder Matthew Cowley of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and his wife, Elva, arrived in Tokyo to tour the mission. Elder Cowley was president of the Pacific Missions and was on his way home from New Zealand. While in Japan, he took the opportunity to dedicate the new mission home on July 17, 1949. Only a handful of members and missionaries were present. Elder Ted Price, one of those first 5 missionaries to Japan after the war, was the only person to make a contemporaneous record of the dedication. He made notes of what Elder Cowley said in the prayer, and that evening he recorded what he heard in his journal. 7 years after the dedication, on December 31st, 1956, the year I was born, Ted Price sent a letter to the church historian's office in Salt Lake, so an account of Elder Cowley's dedicatory prayer would be part of the church record. In his letter, Brother Price wrote, "In this inspired and inspiring prayer, Elder Cowley gave thanks for countless blessings in the Lord's work here to date, and went on to prophesy, there will someday be many church buildings and even temples in this land. I was sitting on the first row in this gathering and clearly heard these words. As was my practice, I wrote these important things in my journal that same evening while they were fresh in my mind." Matthew Cowley's prophecy about temples being built in Japan was delivered in the living room of the mission home in Tokyo, shown here in this 1966 photo of the Tokyo Relief Society. When Elder Price became mission president in 1976, a decade after this photo was taken, I was serving as a young missionary in Japan, and he called me to serve in the mission home with him. He told me repeatedly about Matthew Cowley's prophecy. He knew I was interested in church history, and he told me that he worked for a time as a young man in the church historian's office, the place where I would end up spending most of my career. In my journal for Thursday, July 8, 1976, I recorded one of President Price's testimonies about a temple being built in Japan. "The president made some very notable remarks," I wrote. "He noted the fulfillment of modern-day prophecies regarding this mission, particularly the one uttered by the great apostle Matthew Cowley, who stood in the living room of this mission home and prophesied that temples would be built in this land." Brothers and sisters, I heard this prophecy from one who heard it and recorded it. President Price heard it from a prophet, seer, and revelator who gave the prophecy at a time when there were only 8 operating temples in the world, none of them outside the United States or its possessions. I am grateful that I have lived to see this prophecy come true. I was a missionary in Japan and attended the area conference in which President Spencer W. Kimball announced a temple to be built in Japan. I lived for months on the mission home property that became the site for the Tokyo Temple. My wife Shirley and I were living in Japan with our children when the Tokyo Temple was dedicated, and she and I attended the dedication. I have since rejoiced at the dedication of other temples in Japan. This is the Church of Jesus Christ. He calls inspired leaders and guides the church through them in these latter days. He speaks through them, and all his promises shall be fulfilled, even as Matthew Cowley's prophecy of temples in Japan has been and is being fulfilled. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.